Come and join us here on the stalls, all the speakers. You're invited to come back now for Q&A. We have Joy, Moritz, Solon, Simone. I hope you're now enjoying this combination of technical and sociological and historical perspectives on bias. And I think it also really helps us start to question some of the somewhat more simple perspectives that bias is a thing that can just be removed or neutralized in data sets and machine learning systems. It's got a lot more complex than that, and there's a very deep history for us to contend with. So now we want to open the floor to you. This is your chance for questions. Great to see that Kathy's got one right off the bat. We have mic runners who are going to bring you mics. So as you think of them, please raise your hands and we'll have people come to you. First up, we have Kathy O'Neill.
Hi, wonderful guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm really fascinated by your discussion, Moritz, about how we don't have enough information if we just look at probability distributions. And this is something that has come to me in a sort of backdoor way, which is that I feel like instead of talking about probability distribution, we should talk about the use case, the moral use cases. And I'm wondering if that is the lens through. And it's also the side effect of that is it's very understandable to people. Like once you explain, here's the moral issue in this context, here's the moral, if you have like an encyclopedia of like 100 different use cases, I feel like maybe that's the way to do it. What would you think?
Yeah, so it's on. Okay, thanks for the question. It's something I would, certainly think about as well. I think tying fairness to use cases is very important. I think we should probably move from this kind of abstract discussion of fairness properties to understanding the task that we're trying to solve and sort of what our objective is and what our goals are. And so I think that ties into it, but I think it's not the only issue. We also need to understand better where the data came from and what sort of how it was measured, how it was generated, sampled, and so on. And what interventions we might be able to make to change the data that we have and get. Yeah, if you make that part of the use case, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Arvin Narayanan up the back.
Solon made the point that sometimes what we call fair machine learning can be seen as unacknowledged affirmative action. And I found that very interesting, very provocative. Had never thought about that before. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit in a couple of ways. Do you see this as an occasional problem, or is much of what we're talking about fall into this umbrella? Are there any examples you can give? Just a little bit more intuition on that.
Yeah, thanks, Arvin. I think what I was trying to suggest is that many of the problems that fairness in machine learning has tried to address are ultimately reducible to questions of accuracy. And there are going to be circumstances, though, when that's not the case. And so if the reason, for instance, the data reflects that certain people perform better on the job than others, is that they were actually subject to discriminatory treatment in the workplace itself, sort of what is the data generating mechanism in that case? We might want to say that that's not an appropriate basis to then assess future people about their performance, even if it might mean that under those circumstances, they would go on to perform less well than others. So I think the idea then is if we compensate for that in some way by saying we should actually imagine how they would perform under better circumstances, under more acceptable or desirable circumstances, one thing that might happen is something along the lines of providing some kind of boost for people who otherwise would not be assessed as favorably given current circumstances.
Thanks. We have a question here up the back.
Hi, yeah, thanks for your great talks. There was a bit of a theme of biased data sets, and I really like the way Joy put it as skewed data sets. I thought that was very good wording. I'm wondering, I guess for all of you, does an unbiased data set exist, or is there some kind of approach to collecting data sets that would handle removing skew in some way, or is that sort of a fake ideal? I'm curious what you guys think.
As far as an unbiased data set, that I have not come across, and as long as human hands are involved in curating our data, there will be some type of bias, and maybe that bias is to positive effect depending on the context in which you're using it. I think what we need to do is move away from bias eradication to bias awareness, and again, a contextual understanding in terms of how the data is being used. So in the case of benchmarks, we shouldn't be in a situation where we look at a single metric and delude ourselves into thinking we've made progress when you look back at the data and the skews themselves are not representative of target populations if you're looking at a national set or internationally. That's why I talk about the undersampled majority, which is not represented in this room.
And just add very briefly, I think that's a very important point I want to underline that you make, that we should move away from bias eradication to awareness. And an example I like to give is genomic data or DNA. It'd be really hard to remove ancestry information or a sort of correlation with race from the DNA. And so I think we should first understand what are we going to do with the data and what is the task we're trying to solve. And then it's easier to talk about this issue.
We have a question here from Rob Sparrow, and then over here to Tim Nett.
So I guess I'm worried that the emphasis on fairness as accuracy misses the element of fairness as process and the ways in which the process might itself shape outcomes. If you imagine a workplace review process, for instance, the dialogue that might occur in those cases itself can shape outcomes in interesting ways. So I guess I'm worried about the framing here as, you know, taking a data set and producing an outcome and the only criteria is accuracy. I mean, are there ways of representing that question about the nature of the process itself as socially transformative in this problematic?
I'd love to hear what Simone and Solon have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take the point. I mean, what I guess I would say is that so much of existing law and policy is focused on process, and what is actually somewhat interesting and different about some of this recent work is that it's given us a way to think a bit more than about process itself. However, I think what I was trying to suggest is along the lines of what you were also saying, which is that if everything is reduced ultimately to a problem of accuracy, we will not get at a lot of the much more fundamental institutional problems that we want to address, and that those actually require intervention into the process, into procedure. And so we really do want to think about what other things we can put in place besides some technical mechanism at the point of decision-making that will actually really transform how these institutions function.
And I think for me, a question is more about the right of refusal for these, facial recognition technologies or so. So who are the communities that these technologies are often tested on first? People who can't refuse, often people crossing borders, people who are claiming refugee status, students, prisoners, people who are on social assistance. And so those are often the testing grounds of these technologies. So rather than think about how can we make these less biased or quote-unquote unbiased, it's thinking about the social conditions of where these technologies are applied and what are the technologies, that kind of tactical resistance that and maybe a politics of resistance that we can also talk about rather than, making a better machine.
Thank you. Tim over here, and then a question here from Heather Roth.
Hi, thanks for the great talks. I had a question for Moritz. I kind of agree with Kathy, where she said that we should take the use case into account, because for me, I was actually thinking about this research question. I do think we should model the data, for sure, like the underlying process of the data. But what I would want in my head is some knob to say, if, I have external knowledge about how this, data could have been biased, for example, in the criminal justice case, it would be extreme policing, in certain communities, then I would want to know how that would affect my outcome in some way, right? So I wouldn't assume that I know exactly how the data was generated. There's some uncertainty in there, like it probably was generated this way or that way, then I'd want a knob to adjust it. And then another one was just a comment that we're talking about machine learning algorithms outputs being accuracy. But I think right now in the AI community, we're also working on a lot of other stuff. Like we're trying to make machines that reason. We're working on visual question answering. And I think in that case, this question of fairness becomes even more complicated and more important. So I think the accuracy case is probably like the simplest possible case we can think about. But then in the future, I can think of all sorts of other cases that are more complicated.
Yeah, so your first point is something that is excellent and I completely agree with. So I don't have anything to add to that. I think we should totally do that. The second point, I also strongly agree with, and I think people are trying to apply machine learning to a lot of scenarios where we don't have a good measure of accuracy even, or we don't have our criteria of what's a good solution are very subjective. And that's in a whole other can of worms where it's much harder to say anything reasonable. But in some sense there, the failure point is even earlier when we use machine learning, and we should maybe not use machine learning for all things like beauty contests or something. That's not something we should be doing. And so machine learning should not be used for everything. And I think we should start with very well-defined settings where we have a lot of control on what we want to measure.
Excellent. For our final question, Heather Roth.
I think it segues in quite well. So when we're thinking about, data, and so you mentioned the beauty contest, right? This is a social, political, cultural thing. And so, in the social sciences, I'm going to make a plug for the social sciences and the humanities here, right? I think one of the things that we do, at least as political scientists, is we attempt to do random sampling of populations to ensure that you are getting a representative sample. And from what I've heard in this room and what I continue to hear when we talk about data generation and where we get data and how we get data is there's no random sampling here, right? It's so beyond random. So one of the things about the skewed data is maybe part of the fairness solution is actually to re-skew the data towards randomness rather than looking at, okay, so I'm getting data from policing and refugees, and that population looks significantly different than the rest of the population of the world. And so maybe what I need to do is intervene to re-skew towards random. So maybe that's a way towards fairness, a la Rob's point. But again, even that assumes a particular viewpoint of fairness that is itself culturally biased. So I would kind of want to throw that Western kind of fair thing happening in the discussion.
A great provocation. Final comments from the group before we move on to our next set.
I think the point on putting in a skew is interesting in terms of what we do for intentionality when it comes to curation, acknowledging that the majority of our data sets we have right now are based on convenient sampling. And so that's something I continue to explore. And another part I definitely want to focus on is when it comes to phenotype. This is something that I haven't seen much research on, at least when you're looking within automated facial analysis. When we only look at demographics, we forget about the intra-class variation. So I'll leave it at that, but that's something I've been thinking about.
This was a fantastic set of talks that spoke very closely to each other. Thank you so much, everyone on the bias panel. We'll ask you to take your seats now, and we are going to now have our next group, which is going to be on labor and automation. A huge round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.